Welcome to the Stanley Museum of Art. My name is Kimberly Datchik. I'm the curator of learning and engagement here. Thank you all for coming out on this freezing cold night to see this fantastic lecture by Johanna Winters. I'm going to start by taking a moment to read the University of Iowa Land Acknowledgement. The University of Iowa is located on the homelands of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Bahoji, Iowa, Chickapew, Kickapoo, Ametmeneowak, Menominee, Miamaka, Miami, Natuchi, Missouri, Omaha, Omaha, Wazaji, Osage, Jiware, Oto, Ottawa, Ottawa, Ponca, Ponca, Potawatomi, Neshnabé, Meskwaki, Nimahaki, Sakawaki, Sac and Fox, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Sioux, Sanish, Nobashka, Nueta, three affiliated tribes, and the Ho-Chunk Nation. The following tribal nations: Omaha, Omaha Tribe of Nebraska and Iowa, Ponca, Ponca Tribe of Nebraska, Meskwaki, Sac and Fox of the Mississippi and Iowa, and Ho-Chunk, Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska, nations continue to thrive in the state of Iowa, and we continue to acknowledge them. As an academic institution, it is our responsibility to acknowledge the sovereignty and the traditional territories of these tribal nations, and treaties that were used to remove these tribal nations, and the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution since 1847. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, understanding the historical and current experience of Native peoples will help inform the work we do. Collectively, as a university, to engage in building relationships through academic scholarship, collaborative partnerships, community service, enrollment and retention efforts, acknowledging our past, our present, and future Native nations. And now I'm going to hand it over to Terry Conrad, who is an assistant professor in printmaking and who was the 2015-2016 Grant Wood Fellow, to formally announce and introduce Johanna.
Right. So first off, the School of Art and Art History would like to thank the Stanley Museum for this continued partnership. We'd also like to thank the Office of Community Engagement. I want to recognize Jim Hayes, for whom none of this would happen. He's the founder of the Grant Wood Colony. And I also want to just point out Maura Pilcher, who's the director of the Grant Wood Art Colony. For those of you that don't know, the Grant Wood Fellowship is an opportunity where artists come to the School of Art and Art History for a year and within other programs, and they focus on studio and teach for a year. So basically teach one class over the semester. And I can say from personal experience, it's life-changing. So I've been a fan of Johanna Winters' work for a while now. It's a beautiful mix of printmaking, puppetry, and movement. Through this means, Johanna shows us that printmaking has an expansive language that covers memory, presence, relic, and mimicry. The work uses a complex mix of humor, sadness, and grace. So before jumping into Johanna's resume, I want to point out in this short time, she's done a lot of really great things. So last semester, she organized a really great show with her students in the advanced printmaking class. And you can see some of the hats that kind of was from the exhibition there. Brought in a visiting artist and led a really wonderful workshop, did a workshop within the community, and attended graduate print workshop and didn't have to, did it on volunteering just to sort of get to know the graduate printmakers. Actually the list is much longer, but my point is Johanna is a creative teacher and really making an impact in printmaking and the School of Art and Art History. I think the students probably have a much longer list that they could add to this. So Johanna holds an MFA from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and a BFA from Wisconsin, Green Bay. She's been awarded at residencies at the Corporation of Yaddo, the Elizabeth Murray Artist Residency, the Lawrence Art Center, Acre, Vermont Studio Center, Aeromont School of the Arts and Craft, Gutenberg Arts, Gephardt Academy of Fine Arts in Wrocław, Poland. Her work has been exhibited and performed nationally, recently at the Stern Theater in Kansas City, Missouri, Drama Club, Chicago, Illinois, the Co-op Gallery, Nashville, Tennessee, So Visual Arts Center in Minneapolis. And most recently, Johanna has shown her work at the H&R Block Art Space in Kansas City as part of the 2022 Charlotte Street Foundation Visual Artist Fellowship Award. So I just want to also say that we hope to see you in mid-April at the Grant Wood Fellows exhibition, which will be at the Drew Lowe Gallery at the School of Art and Art History. Johanna and Michael Dixon, hello. Yeah. The current Grant Wood Fellow in painting will be sharing recent works completed during the fellowship. So if you could help me welcome Johanna. Hi.
Can you all hear me okay in the back? I'm kind of afraid of the microphone, so I'll do my best. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you, Terry, for that introduction. I'm going to be sharing some thoughts with you about how I see printmaking and puppetry having a common language between the concepts of mimesis and precarity, and how these ideas are showing up in my recent work. And for context, I studied printmaking in undergrad and graduate school, and that was really my first love of the studio and of making. But while in graduate school, I became really invested in puppetry as a way to visually speak about ideas that felt too vulnerable or uncomfortable to speak of. Those ideas have still carried through in my work, and that has to do with the shame and pleasure and disappointment and privilege of aging. Oops, skipping ahead. Particularly aging in a female body. And so performing behind a marionette form or under a mask has become this way that has allowed me to feel hidden, but also a little bit brave in the work. So I've been able to lean into that discomfort of performing in front of an audience while wearing a mask or articulating a puppet. And I've become to use puppetry as a strategy in my work to talk about ideas around desire and lonesomeness and hopefulness, and essentially the human experience of being in a body. In terms of how I'm thinking about mimesis, I think of it as a concept that bridges printmaking and puppetry, because both a printed image and a puppet have this way of imitating or resembling or misbehaving as a reflection or a representation or a reversioning. So these are two examples of etchings that happened around the same time that I was getting interested in puppetry and making masks. And the facial expressions from these drawings, I think, are directly translated into the kind of puppet forms that I was creating. So these are two forms before they got arms and legs attached to them, and they're made out of paper mache. And they are, I think, showing grimacing expressions of puppets that mimic those from the prints. And these are two recent, what I consider portraits of a puppet character that I've developed over the last year. I think of these prints as mimicking both the presence and an absence of a self, and asking, what does that presence or absence look like? And what does the puppet think of herself? And how does she see herself? And these were made at the University of Iowa Print Studio. I talk about Grey Gardens quite a bit as an influential film for me in my puppet journey. This is a 1975 documentary by the Maysles brothers that follows a mother-daughter pair who come from a moneyed New England family, but at the time of the documentary, they lived in squalor and lived very reclusively. And I think that the idea of mimesis shows up in this film in how little Edie, the daughter, is performing a version of herself for the camera. I think that she is flirting with the camera and, by extension, flirting with the audience. And I find that to be both very seductive and unsettling at the same time. So she's aware of being regarded and is kind of enjoying it. And that tension is something that I am very attracted to. And I find that type of regarding and wanting to be regarded is a way that I've pursued work in my own studio. And this is the first puppet performance that I made around 2016. It was heavily influenced by by Grey Gardens, and it's titled Dowagers. In this show, I was exploring what it means to be a woman losing social currency with age and what it means to fear becoming invisible or obsolete. So the puppets, both the masks and the marionettes, allow me to hide behind the content and shield myself a bit from this vulnerability of performing. During the performance, the puppeteers would wake up the marionettes and groom them, put them back to sleep. They would play cards, drink cocktails, serve pâté to the audience. I was intentionally pursuing a bit of humor in the work as another way to kind of protect myself from being immensely embarrassed. So there is a way to find humor in some of this puppet work, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But essentially from this performance, I learned that masking my discomfort has become a tactic for me in the work that I make. And it's sort of like a formal feature that I think I can name it declaratively. Another quality that I am thinking about as a way to align printmaking and puppetry is precarity. In most printmaking processes, there is an extended period of uncertainty or unpredictability. And I think any of the printmakers in the room can attest to that. There's a lot of examples of that. For instance, the moment when your plate is emerging from an acid bath, or the moment when you pull a print off of the press to reveal whatever outcome you subjected your plate to. These are all instances of a precariousness that's been extended. And I think that there's an acceptance and a relishing of that precarity within printmaking. I think that puppets as performing objects are also unpredictable and unstable and precarious. Once they're animated by a human or a mechanized touch, they become immediately familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. They're both human and not human at once. And I feel that refusal to be nameable is what draws me to a puppet form, whether it's an object that I'm performing with or an object that I'm sort of embodying. This is a still image from a puppet figure performance where I'm intentionally not wearing a mask, and so I'm choosing not to hide. My gaze follows the gaze of the puppet as she looks out at the audience, and there's a more direct confrontation built into that performance. It was terrifying. Shadow puppetry is another form that I'm really interested in working with. You're behind a screen, you're hidden from the audience, but you're able to use really expressive gestures with just small paper cutout puppets. So it removes a lot of the stuff of previous work where there were props and stage settings. And here I'm just using vintage overhead projectors as sort of lo-fi technology. They become tabletop stages for the puppets. And this is a still image from my first, I guess, full-length feature shadow theater performance. And this is another still image from that performance. It's titled The Middle Tell, and it was a live show and sound piece about 3 bards who were coming undone over the course of the performance. They were confronting repressions of female desire and how it's inhibited, diminished, and sustained over a lifetime. They didn't have a spoken language. Their language was more of a hinging of limbs and dousing of light. And I was thinking about what it looks like to express anguish quietly. And I have some documentation from this performance for you. So that gives you an idea of the sort of cadence and dissonance that existed in that performance, which was about 30 minutes. And as you could see in the documentation, the performers were behind screens. And so there was this kind of in between the audience and performers where the audience could glimpse how the work was being made using overhead projectors. But I really enjoyed that ability to sort of keep some of the mechanism hidden, but also reveal it a bit. So when considering the delicate actions that are necessary to manipulate a shadow puppet, I am thinking about further connections between printmaking and puppetry and shadow puppets especially. And that connection is through touch and gesture and tenderness, and that translation of tenderness to paper or to image or to screen or to shadow. This is a still image from a video and performance project where I worked with a choreographer to devise a short dance that I performed in unison with these two puppet characters. It's titled How to Behave. And this piece for me feels like an outlier within my work because it's intentionally funny. I made this work because I wanted to make myself laugh. In terms of timing, it was made within the first year of living with the pandemic. And so I felt that making something joyful was very necessary. So the pinkish oval aperture that you see here is a viewing device that I used in the video to accentuate the notion of us peering in at the performer, and whether she knows she's being watched or not is a bit ambiguous. And I have documentation of this as well, but I'm going to adjust the volume. Okay. Oops, my bad. Sneak peek. You're allowed to laugh. I'm sorry if that song is stuck in your head. It's kind of it's an earworm. All right, so you got a preview of this slide, which always feels like an abrupt segue, but it's intentional. I, in a past life, was a professional cross-country skier, both in college and after college. I trained on a national team that was sort of a feeder program for the Olympic team. So ever since that period, I've been trying to find a connection between that part of me that was an athlete and the part of me that is an artist. And for a long time, I didn't really see a connection, but I'm thinking about the performativity of competition and endurance effort and how this shows up in my work now. And I especially think that being regarded or being scrutinized by a coach or by your teammates or by your competition is a way of seeking validation. And I think that quality is something that is present in the work that I'm pursuing now. These are some detail images of the puppets from the dance. So they are presented as both sculpture or prop or, static object. And they're all made of paper mache. These have a bit of cotton fabric in them, very lightweight and easy to manipulate. These are still images from that series of videos, that How to Behave film stills, and they're exemplary of that kind of invented peephole that I was using as a suggestion of a body part or an ocular cavity of creating this sort of double gaze where we are peering down at the character and she's also looking down at herself. So bringing this back to the concept of precarity, I think about David Hammond's body print series quite often. These particular prints in this series were made by covering parts of his body in grease and then carefully pressing himself onto the paper and then kind of lifting himself up off the paper, flocking the greasy imprints with pigment. And then the resulting image is this really rich detail fragmentation of his body and his clothing. And I think that these images reflect precarity because they're traces of evidence of the body, but not the body itself. And this is an image of Hammond's pressing himself onto the paper. And I can't help but think about the intimacy and tenderness of this gesture and that sort of, that type of touch that's required to make this work. The puppet props that result from my videos and performances also become fragments of the body that suggest a presence or a touch or some type of tenderness. They're also very parched and crackled. The surface of the paper mache suggests an injury or overuse, and that's pretty consistent throughout all of the forms that I build. These are two prints that suggest this idea of a presence of a body, and it's again translated from two-dimensional into three-dimensional, from sculpture back into print. And so I've thought about printmaking as a way that I am drawing through ideas. I use the printing press primarily as a drawing tool to sort of work through visual iterations of this puppet, but in two-dimensional form. So the puppet body is the last main concept I want to touch on tonight. I think of the puppet body as something that is unstable and unpredictable. It's both familiar and unfamiliar. It's a shield and a shell and a costume and a prop. And I think it resists static definition. You look at her and wonder, what is she? She is, for me, someone I refer to as the protagonist. And I've developed this character over the last about a year and a half, and she is performing her sensuality for the camera. She is often within environments that are devoid of any human presence. She's often alone, and she very much wants to be witnessed as a desired subject. In making this work, I've been thinking about Gretchen Henderson's text, The Cultural History of Ugliness. Gretchen Henderson describes ugliness as a reevaluation of what is out of place. It occupies a tenuous space between the known and the misunderstood, and it's a marker of otherness and difference and affliction. So these are two bodies that are defined by what they are not, as in they are not beautiful. This is the Ugly Duchess and Frankenstein. I like to think that if beauty is stable and predictable, then perhaps ugliness can be an opportunity for possibility. So this is the protagonist again. In videos and performances, I have become her embodied chaperone as she rehearses her desire for an encounter with another. Her bed becomes a stage where she performs her desire or her loneliness. And I think of this work as in between puppetry and performance, and also in between caricature and portraiture. The title of this series of videos is called In Case of Romance, and you can see the subtitles on the video are sort of written in a fake invented phonetic language. I think of that as either coming from within the puppet's interior self, or it's an outside voice giving directives. It's an ambiguous source. And I like how the strange spelling sort of forces a slowed down interpretation. The words have to be sounded out in your head or on your tongue for you to come to a comprehension, but there's a delay in understanding. And you'll get to try that out in this clip from the video series. So I've also pulled together some digital images from my personal archive as a way of curating things that I've been paying attention to. So I've got examples of fragmented bodies and constructed bodies, and wailing bodies, rejoicing bodies, medieval bodies, puppet bodies, and embarrassing bodies. And I'm trying to remind myself that I do look at things other than what the Instagram algorithm feeds me. And it's sort of a useful practice in recalling that what I'm paying attention to informs my work. And this is just a comparison of a still image from a video piece by Bridget Moser, and then toes of a puppet that I made. And as another comparison, a Northern Renaissance painting of Mary nursing an infant Jesus, and an early version of these puppet characters that were from a previous slide. This is another still image from the In Case of Romance video series. And in this video, I think there's more of a suggestion of other possibilities for the protagonist besides being alone in a room. There's a suggestion of another presence, and it's kind of sexy, kind of hopeful. And those are ideas I'm trying to introduce into the work a little bit more. And I have documentation of this as well. And that video piece and the previous one from this series are intended to be displayed as a 2-channel video. So they're playing at the same time on separate screens. And so your attention is very much pulled in between the two, trying to read the subtitles, but also follow the imagery and kind of decide what is occurring or when it's occurring. In service of showing evidence of the confusion and doubt and excitement that happens in making the work, these are some recent studio views that show a little bit of kind of behind the scenes before the polished, finished thing is presented into the world. I always appreciate it when artists can kind of pull the curtain back a little bit. This is, I guess, as much as I'm willing to do. And this is the protagonist again in her full glory. She is shy, but also a bit boastful, and you should keep an eye out for her this spring. She's going to be in some new video work that will debut in the School of Art in the Grant Wood Fellow Show in April. That's where I'm going to leave you all. And thanks so much for coming to my talk. Happy to. I think we have time for some Q&A. If there's any questions from the audience, we've got a microphone.
Question. So as an athlete and an artist, can you talk about the junction between the two and how you employ what you learned as an athlete today as an artist?
I'm primarily, well, I used to think that maybe it's through the studio practice that is the crossover, where there's like an endurance effort in the studio, and I'm accustomed to that kind of rigor in training for an endurance sport, and that commonality is maybe less interesting to me now as this idea that I got really addicted to performing as a competitor, and that's maybe a quality that's present in the work where I'm both like terrified and drawn to this kind of performance through putting on a costume and getting in front of people and feeling very uncomfortable. But like before this talk, I was, truth be told, quite nervous, and it felt the same way as if I was going to compete at a race. It's, I don't know, it's the same sort of embodied nervousness. Yeah.
I noticed that you use overhead projectors in your work, and I'm curious, like, where do you get them at this point?
Yeah.
Has it been hard to find the kind of analog, physical, mechanical equipment that you work with?
You can get projectors on eBay shipped to your doorstep. Yeah. Yeah. I think some schools still have them like in storage, or universities might have them in storage. I haven't, the ones that I purchased were, I think, purchased in like 2018. So I'm sure there's some still out there, but I think they're kind of expensive now because people have figured out that artists want to buy them and there's a demand for them. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering, I wanted to know a little more about sound in your work, and if you could just talk a little bit about how sound has shifted across the various projects. It was really beautiful to see the development of form and gesture, and also it seems like the scores have shifted from the loud middle tone to the quieter current pick, and yeah, I'm just wondering if you're thinking about that and where it's going from here.
Thank you for that question. I have enjoyed working with sound artists on developing a score for pieces like the middle tell, and the puppet dance with the two puppets in front and back. That one felt maybe a little more gimmicky in terms of how I was using sound. I mean, it made me laugh, and that's why I chose it. But the most recent video pieces definitely kind of peel away that layer of audio, and it's mostly just breathing and ambient sound, sort of like the sound of the room. I essentially took a recording of my breath inside the mask, and so there's like a really slight crinkle that you can hear as the mask is raising and falling, with each breath. It's much easier to hear when you're like wearing headphones, but sound typically feels secondary to me, and I'd like to think about it in a more like just as equal as the imagery. So that's kind of the direction I would like to go, but so far I'm mostly focusing on what this character sounds like when she's breathing to herself. Yeah. Okay. Oh, one more.
This is kind of related to that question of what you just said, because I was thinking about the reading the words and how you've manipulated the kind of spelling, like the phonetic quality of that. And at first I was reading them within like the Grey Gardens accent. And that kind of New England affected. I'm wondering, like, what is the sound of, you read them just as regular English, but inside your head, in this persona, is there a sound developing? Not to push the Grey Gardens accent to this character, but there's a sense of like that kind of effectiveness, that culture, that the performativity of those accents trying to say like, we are different, we are like kind of a different species than
Right.
the rest of the world.
I love this question. I think I've resisted putting a sound to a voice. Over all of the work that I've made, there's never been like a spoken dialogue. And I've tried to figure out other ways of pointing at language, whether it's like with the shadow puppet hinging forms and dousing light, or subtitles or breath. So that's still a question that I have in the work. Like, what would she sound like? I'm still trying to figure out like, what does she want, or who does she want? So I think that question of what does she sound like is within that basket of questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll keep thinking about that. All right. Thank you all so much. I appreciate you all being here, and look for some puppets this spring. Thank you.